now that we know who has been running these companies and creating all of this economic growth, it is important to look at the effects that all of this is having on the actual employees, and to take a look at what it's like to work in some of these factories. And obviously conditions are not going to be very good. So that's going to lead us into some attempts at labor reform, labor unions, and then we'll be talking about some strikes. So obviously factories are sort of the most logical thing. When you own a major corporation and you need to mass produce things, you can cram lots of machines and things into one room, and it's just sort of the best business plan in terms of producing a good. So companies want to make sure that they make the highest amount of profits possible. And we've talked about that before. We talked about that previously when we were discussing cutting wages and, creating different tactics like cartels and horizontal and vertical integration. But it's also the most effective way to cut costs is to cut wages. So this involves hiring a lot of immigrants, right? Because immigrants are willing to work for such a low price, and most of them are willing to take really whatever job they can get, because when they come to the United States, they really don't have a whole lot of options. A lot of them don't have any particular skills, so they're really a lot more desperate than native-born white Americans might be. So working at a factory, you typically work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week at this time. Sweatshops are fairly popular. Sweatshops are small, hot, dark, dirty warehouses where they would employ thousands of people in one spot, mostly women, and they would work on mass production machines. So textile mills or whatever it is that they're working on. Most factories and sweatshops especially are run on a very strict schedule. Remember, we spoke last semester about the Lowell girls and their schedule of bells. Not everyone used bells, but that's a good example of how strict their schedule was. Working in these factories was very dangerous. There are a lot of, working in tight spaces can be bad for your physical and your mental health. A lot of people go deaf from how loud the machines are. There's virtually no training at all. They just sort of throw you right in and you got to figure it out, but that can leave you open to injury when you don't exactly know how to work the machines that you're operating and how they could be dangerous. But it doesn't really matter if someone gets injured on the job to the company, because there's always someone else to pick up the slack. There's always someone that we can hire to replace them, just around the corner. And that's at the time, we also had no workers' compensation or anything like that. So it's not like you would have to pay that employee if they got injured. They were just sort of like, SOL. Obviously, families were typically a lot bigger back then than they are today. Many women in the working class were holding jobs that you could say were typically stereotypically female jobs, like laundresses, typists, things like that. When you have a big family, obviously both parents have to work, but you're really going to depend on the children to work as well. 1 in 5 children between the ages of 10 and 16 held a factory job. This is extremely dangerous. Children had very poor physical and mental growth for being in this environment for so long. They have stunted growth, poor eyesight, bad language skills because they're not getting any social interaction. When we start to see the negative effects that working in these factories can have on children in the long run, then we really start to see the beginning of the child labor movement, or the beginning of the movement to end child labor. That's going to start happening, but it's still probably going to be another, I guess you could say, 30 to 40 years before we finally end child labor. Now, company towns are a really interesting tool that companies would use to their advantage to try to make the most money off of their employees. Certain trades, like mining, for example, required their employees to live in isolated communities near their workplace. So their rent would be sort of just taken right out of their paycheck ahead of time. These were not like dorm-style buildings like how the Lowell girls lived in. These were small houses designed for tiny, well, really any size family. A lot of times they would force their employees to buy all their stuff, all their goods at the company store, and they would sell all that on credit, but they would charge a really high interest. So a lot of their income would still just go back to the employer. So this is really sort of just like the northern industrial version of sharecropping, taking so much away from the employee before they ever have a chance to get it back. Obviously, if you're in debt to your boss, you cannot leave and try to find a new job. And so this is basically called wage slavery. It was also very common for company towns to be kept ethnically segregated because they wanted to encourage distrust among employees. They didn't want everyone to sort of band together and try to push for reform or anything like that. Now, obviously, whenever you have a situation where people are working in such bad conditions, it's not going to be long before someone comes along and is like, hey, I think that if we band together, we can improve our own situation. And that's when we're going to see the birth of labor unions. Now, the first labor union in the United States, the first national labor union in the United States was the National Trades Union, founded in 1834. It only lasted a few years because we hit a recession and then a depression in the late 1830s. And obviously when people get laid off, there's really no point in being in a union. So a lot of people eventually left the union and the union sort of fizzled out. But when we see this union working here in the beginning in these 1830s, working in movements like the 10-hour movement and things like that, we start to see the tools that unions can use to make them so successful. One is collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when you negotiate as a group for higher pay and like fair treatment of workers, shorter working hours, things like that. So in collective bargaining, whatever decision is made between the employer and the union, it affects all employees, not just the employees in the union. Not every employee is always in a union. Some people don't want to get involved in unions. They can be dangerous. They can be corrupt organizations. It can be drama. They might think that they'll end up with a target on their back if they try to join a union. So not everyone is in the union, but when a union has collective bargaining rights, whatever the union accomplishes applies to all employees, not just the ones actually in the union. Strikes are definitely going to be the most popular and common form of I guess not negotiating, but protesting and trying to push for reform. They're most successful when they involve all of the employees across the state or the country of that business. So like if you are striking against a national business, it's the most effective when you get all the employees across the country to participate, or all the employees at least in your state to participate, because you need to sort of send the message of how big of an economic impact the employees can have on that one business. But strikes can be very tricky, and we'll talk about them a little bit later. So socialism is really going to be a prominent problem for a lot of labor unions, a good thing and a bad thing, and as well as communism. So let's talk about both of these things. So socialism is not brand new at this point. Socialism actually started to spread around the 1830s, back when our first labor union did. But socialism basically favors public, and by public I mean government, control of property and income. Communism is favoring complete government control of property and income. So socialism is just where the government is more involved in your life and they have more control over property and more control over income. But in communism, everything is controlled by the government. It is total control over property and total control over income. In socialism and in communism, wealth should be and would be distributed fairly equally, if not totally equally. So in 1848, these two guys, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, they get together and they publish this book, The Communist Manifesto, and that's when they really create the idea of communism, sort of expanding on socialism. And communism, I'm sure you can imagine, if you don't already know, is really the total opposite of capitalism, and that's what the United States is based on. So they denounce capitalism in the book, basically, saying it's like of the devil and we shouldn't use it ever. They said that eventually the working class would overthrow this capitalistic upper class. Now, most Americans have and always will totally reject the ideas of communism and, to a certain degree, socialism, because it really threatens all of the things that our country is founded on, in terms of economics, like free enterprise, trade, private property. There is no such thing as private property in communism. Liberty, none of that is really possible in communism, and those things are difficult in socialism. So it's obviously going to be very opposed by the wealthy. The wealthy are not down for communism at all, but it is supported a great deal by the labor movement, which makes sense. If you're a poor immigrant employee at some factory where they just make you work 12 hours a day for like 10 cents an hour, and your life is showing no signs of improvement. No matter how hard you work, you're having a really difficult time working your way up the economic ladder, and here come these two guys with massive beards telling you that if we all band together, you can overthrow the upper class and provide a better future for our country and better life for your family. That is a enticing offer. So obviously a lot of people in the lower class and in the labor class are going to be really drawn into socialism and communism. Now, there are a lot of socialists and communists in labor unions, but not everyone in a labor union is a socialist or a communist. So that's important to remember as we go forward here. So the Knights of Labor are definitely one of the most famous labor unions to be around during this time, if not the famous. They were founded in 1869 by this guy, Uriah Stevens, and it included all workers. Anyone could be in the Knights of Labor, skilled or unskilled. Obviously, unskilled does not mean that you are like useless and you don't have any good qualities. An unskilled worker is just like a regular factory employee, but a skilled worker is someone who practices a particular trade, like a blacksmith or an iron worker, someone who knows how to do one thing specifically really well that it takes some time to learn how to do. The Knights of Labor also actively recruited minorities. They would encourage African Americans to join the Knights of Labor. They even had a lot of female members, but they were very much a socialist organization, and they focused on large social reforms that favored the working class, not just small things like like a higher pay or a shorter working hour or better working conditions. So in 1881, this guy to the far right, Terence V. Powderly, he took control over the Knights of Labor, and Uriah Stevens sort of, I don't know if he died or if he just was like, it's time to retire. But Terence Powderly had a background in politics already. And so he had already been involved in the labor movement, and he had been involved in the Knights of Labor. So he really wanted to make the Knights of Labor more of a household name. He wanted to take the union to the public and get in people's faces more. So really, when we think of the Knights of Labor, we actually think Terence V. Powderly before we would think of Uriah Stevens, because Powderly did so much more. So by 1885, just 4 years after Powderly took control of the union, they had over 700,000 members, which is a very large union. But unfortunately, they're going to fade away just a few years after that, because of some bad publicity that we'll talk about in a minute.